So thank you all for joining me tonight to talk about dueling and a little bit of background on the history of dueling and dueling in America before, during, and right after the American Revolution. And dueling is an old um, idea of honor that dates back long before the American Revolution, long before the colonial period. And I found it very interesting when I was reading about the history of dueling that it dates to medieval times, and it actually was used in some cases in place of a judicial result of something. So for instance, if two people went before the king and one person said the other did whatever, and the other person said, no, they're a liar, and the king had no way to determine who was the honest person, the king might tell them to duel. He might have them fight. And then the winner would obviously be the person who was telling the truth. The king would have to assume that they were both lying, and he would have them have a duel. So that was one of the ways a king might solve a difference of opinion between two subjects. One of the other things they would do was, and I don't know if any of you have seen the magnificent new movie about Henry V on Netflix. It is a wonderful new version of Henry V. If you're a fan of the play Henry V or the story of King Henry V, I highly recommend it. I don't remember the name of it. The name of it is not Henry V, but if you just search for Henry V, you should find it. And it is so wonderfully done that I watched it 2 days in a row. It was so good. And in the beginning of that, in the story, Henry is worried that his younger brother, who's heir to the throne, is he's worried that his younger brother, who's weaker and heir to the throne, is going to throw the kingdom into an unnecessary war. And instead, he challenges the prince of the other kingdom to hand-to-hand duel in armor with swords. And Henry fights this duel on behalf of his younger brother against the other prince. And I'm not going to tell you how it turns out or what happens, but that would be a way of preventing two kingdoms from going to war, that two nobles might fight instead. We have dueling really dating back to medieval times as being a way of solving differences between noblemen. You also know the phrase "throw down the gauntlet," the glove that would go with armor, right? Throw down the gauntlet. One nobleman might challenge another, throw down the gauntlet, and when the other would pick it up, they accepted the challenge to the duel. Oh, this is a great comment that Magna Carta says a woman cannot call for a trial by combat for the killing of anyone but her husband. So, well, that might be a very good thing. We could have some very troubling duels and conflicts occurring otherwise. So I think that's a very good thing. So then we come up through time where duels really continue to be a form of gentlemen seeking honor against each other for insult or for other types of crimes they feel may have been committed against each other. Now, dueling, I found, and I thought this was really interesting, was actually outlawed in Europe and Britain during the reign of George III. One would never suspect this, as there were so many duels, and I see that there were at least 172 recorded duels in England during the reign of George III, when dueling was apparently outlawed. So that is quite interesting and fascinating. And as you know, dueling was taking place here as well during that time. So I guess it being illegal didn't matter. I also found, and this is also very interesting, that dueling was highly frowned upon in New England, where it was looked down upon as a throwback to a barbaric age. And that, you know, New England being Puritans and, in their view, more modern thinking and Christian, looked down upon dueling as a barbaric activity. So it was very highly looked down upon in New England. And I couldn't find any actual recorded duels in New England. So I guess if people were doing it, they were hiding it. Now, Mr. Q was not very happy with the idea of me talking about dueling tonight at all. Him saying that it is not a very ladylike topic for one to discuss. And of course, Mr. Q himself has acted as second in a few duels that supposedly did not take place, of course, but Mr. Q knows quite a bit about dueling himself, so I also spoke to him. But don't you think it would be so exciting to attend a duel? I mean, I just think it would be so exciting to see. And I know I probably shouldn't say that as a lady, but it must be just so thrilling to watch two men stand for each other's honor in such a manner. And dueling, by the way, was something that all gentlemen were prepared to do. And I think, oh, here's a picture of standard 18th century dueling pistols. All gentlemen had a set of dueling pistols. Whether they dueled or not, they kept a set of dueling pistols. And tonight, we're going to talk about a set of pistols that was used in 2 fatal duels. And I found that there was even a very powerful lady who had a set of dueling pistols. Here they are. And these belong to Catherine the Great of Russia. They're currently in the New York City Museum of Modern Art. I found them there, and I don't know that much about Catherine. I should know more. But did she participate in a duel, or did she just have a set of beautiful dueling pistols because she was the queen and the most powerful person in Russia? And you can see the beautiful craftsmanship that went into the handles and the barrels of these pistols. And you can see they're made in St. Petersburg. Beautiful set of dueling pistols belonging to Catherine. So all of the gentlemen had their dueling pistols and were prepared to engage in a duel if necessary, if someone challenged them. Now, there also were rules to dueling, something called the Principles of Dueling, or the Code Duello, and every state or colony or country had their own rules to follow. And for a duel to be considered legal, all of the steps in the code had to be followed, and they are very specific. And you can see these are written by a lieutenant in the British military. So these would be the British rules of dueling, principles of dueling. And some of the things they would delineate here in New York and New Jersey was that the bore of the pistol had to be smooth. There could be no rifling. So there's no grooves in there to direct the direction of the ball. It's a smooth bore, making the gun a little bit less accurate. And I think the length of the bore could not be longer than 8 or 9 inches. So it could not be, you couldn't show up for a duel with your rifle. So that wasn't going to happen. So you couldn't show up with your rifle, stand at a pretty good distance away, and shoot the other person. Both gentlemen had to agree to the set of pistols that were being used, had the right to inspect them, and both gentlemen had to agree as to whether or not use a hair trigger if they were present on those pistols. And that is going to be important in the last duel we'll be talking about today, whether or not that hair trigger was present and whether or not the gentleman used it. There are also procedures for the seconds, the gentlemen that will come with them to the duel. Generally, the seconds will mark out the area where they will stand, and they also will be responsible for inspecting and loading the pistols. The seconds in the New York way of dueling, which is what we'll be discussing tonight, will flip a coin, and the winner of the coin toss will be the second who will call out the steps in the duel. Now, in England, they also tossed a coin, but the winner of the coin toss shot first while his opponent stood still and received his fire. So quite an interesting difference in dueling between Britain and America, that in Britain, to show you were a brave gentleman, you stood and received the other man's fire. And generally they would stand, with their side facing the other person to make a smaller target. And if you survived that first shot, then it was your turn, and your opponent would then stand. And when they were ready, they would receive your fire. And there are a couple of really good depictions of that style of dueling in modern film and TV. One is the TV series I know many of you have watched, Turn, right? In the first season, I think John Simcoe has a duel with our hero, Abraham Woodhull, Culper Jr., and they use those British rules of dueling. And I think that it's Simcoe who wins the coin toss, and Woodhull has to stand there and wait for him to shoot. I think so. If any of you know otherwise, let me know, but I think that's what happened. And the other very methodical and 100% accurate and correct depiction of a duel is in Stanley Kubrick's wonderful film, Barry Lyndon. Although Barry Lyndon is a very slow film, and by the time you get to the duel, or at least by the time we got to the duel, my friends, I believe, wanted to shoot and kill me for making them sit through the duel. One of my friends, someone's laughing, so someone has seen the film. One of my friends was so disgusted in the film, in the middle of the film, he just blurted out, "Can you just shoot each other, please?" But it's a very methodical way of having a duel depicted in Barry Lyndon. And since it's the 21st century, you can really just fast forward to the end till you get to the duel scene. But the movie really is magnificent, with Ryan O'Neal playing a fraudster, right? A social climber, a guy who's a complete fraud and marries his way up through the English aristocracy. He's really excellent in it, as is Marissa Berenson as the widow, the mindless widow that he marries and takes advantage of. And they're both wonderful in that film. Someone is saying The Life and Times of Colonel Blimp, where he's challenged in Germany and finds out that the code says not to eat breakfast, apparently of the risk of stomach wounds. Wow, I thought it would be not eat breakfast for the risk of perhaps vomiting out of fear, which apparently often happened in the duels, and especially in the English duels, when one person had to stand and wait for the other person to fire. So that would be quite a level of terror, I think. I still think it would be exciting to watch. I don't know. Maybe I'm unusual in this respect. So that is the status of dueling when we get to the 18th century. So of course, the British thought we were cowardly shooting at the same time, but in America, we have also always been very reasonable and utilitarian in the way we do things, and equitable. So we shoot at the same time. So the first duel we're going to talk about tonight is a duel between Aaron Burr and John Barker Church. Interestingly, there are no portraits of John Barker Church. And of course, that's the famous Burr portrait done by John Vanderlyn that hangs in the New York Historical Society. And John Barker Church, some of you may know as Alexander Hamilton's brother-in-law. He was married to Angelica Schuyler. And John Barker Church used a pseudonym, John Carter, when he first came to America. He was born in England and apparently was, some sort of businessman who came to America to escape his creditors. He was bankrupt, came to America to escape his creditors. So it's quite shocking the Schuylers would allow their daughter to marry this gentleman, and came to America using the name John Carter, where he then went to work, I think, as a quartermaster of sorts for the American Army during the war. He was an Englishman. Now, he did marry Angelica Schuyler. They eloped in 1777 as both parents, finding out that this John Carter also was a gentleman named John Barker Church running away from his debts, were not pleased with him. And I have a quote here from General Schuyler, who said in a letter to, I think it's a letter to one of the other officers, says, "Carter and my eldest daughter ran off and married on the 23rd instant. Unacquainted with his family, his connections, and situation in life, the match was exceedingly disagreeable to me, and I had signified it to him." So Angelica simply ran off and married John Barker Church, who is a gentleman of dubious character. Well, in 1799, Aaron Burr had returned to New York after serving as a United States Senator. You might know that by now his wife had died. His wife, Theodosia, had died, and his daughter, Theodosia, was now 17 years old and quite a young lady in her own right. Burr returned to New York and ran for the New York Assembly. Here's someone who'd like to join us. He ran for the New York Assembly and was elected again. And he had some reasons for wanting to serve in the Assembly that year. Most notable of them was the eradication of slavery in New York, which he tried to accomplish previously in the New York Assembly in 1783 and 84 and was not successful. Now, having been a senator and having an abolitionist, John Jay, as governor, Senator Burr felt that if he came back to New York and ran for the New York Assembly and achieve that, he might achieve his goal of abolishing slavery, which he and John Jay did achieve. During that time, Mr. Church spread some rumors about Mr. Burr and about his Business dealings. Oh, does this sound familiar? Poor Mr. Burr. And he spread some rumors about Mr. Burr's business dealings, and Mr. Burr challenged him to a duel. Mr. Church accepted the invitation to the duel, and there are some books in your time that say that the pistols used in this duel were the Hamilton pistols, which were later used in the two Hamilton duels. Although I do not believe this is correct, because Burr himself wrote a letter detailing in very minute detail the events of the duel, and he says the guns were his. And when I tell you the events of the duel, you'll understand why I believe the pistols had to have been Mr. Burr's. Mr. Burr's second was a Judge Burke of South Carolina, and Mr. Church's second was a Mr. Hammond, a friend of his from New York. Now, Burr's pistols, the balls for his pistols were improperly made for his gun. They were too small for the barrel of the gun. And in the pistol case was, I don't understand how this would work. I'll have to get Mr. Q to demonstrate it for me. Maybe we can take a video and demonstrate this. Somehow the ball was wrapped with a round piece of chamois leather. And then that leather was oiled so that the ball would move freely through the barrel of the gun. And then the ball, once it was wrapped and oiled, was placed in the barrel of the gun. And Mr. Burr says he was very specific about explaining to both seconds that this was necessary for the proper operation of the guns. Well, when they got to the duel, Mr. Burr said that he noticed that Judge Burke was struggling very hard putting the ball into the barrel of the gun, and that he had the thing they used to load it, and he had a stone, and he was banging on the end of the stone, at which point Mr. Burr said he realized that Judge Burke had forgotten to oil the leather around the ball. So he went over and saw that the ball was stuck in the barrel. But at that time, Mr. Church was standing ready to receive Mr. Burr's fire. And he said that, he says that he ran over and looked, and that Judge Burke at that time simply thrust the gun at Burr and said, well, here you go, Burr. The ball is stuck, but Church is waiting for your fire. So hope this goes well, and we'll reload it for a second round. So Mr. Burr said that he took the gun quietly, knowing his gun would not fire, and went and took his place in the duel, where he stood without stopping the duel, without complaining, and stood and received the fire of Mr. Church, who, luckily missed. And at that point, both gentlemen said they had received satisfaction. They shook hands, and the duel was completed. And I have read that the subject was, a subject of great laughter in the future with Mr. Burr, Mr. Church, and many of the other gentlemen of the town, that Mr. Burr had improperly unloaded the gun, and that Burr could have met his end that day had not Mr. Church been such a crappy shot. Of course, it's possible that Mr. Church purposely wasted his shot or engaged in a délope, which we're going to talk about in a little while. So that is our first duel in 1799. The next unfortunate duel is going to be young Philip Hamilton versus the lawyer George Eacker. And if you've taken my Hamilton and Burr tour, we went to the grave of George Eacker on that tour and talked about the duel. Philip is Alexander Hamilton's firstborn son and the pride and joy of his life. Remember, Mr. Hamilton was an orphan. Shuttled from home to home and raised primarily on his own. So he said that when he married Miss Schuyler, and Mrs. Hamilton presented him with a baby, a firstborn son, he said he was overcome with joy that he could not find words for. He said because here in his arms now was the beginning of the family he always longed for. The family he always longed for and hoped for, the beginning of his family, and even better, a firstborn son. And you might know that at that time, a firstborn son was the thing that all gentlemen prayed their wife would present them with. And I believe in your time, you know that it's the gentleman who is responsible for the whether the baby is a boy or a girl. But at that time, it was not known, so there was quite a bit of pressure on the ladies to have a firstborn son. And, well, Eliza produced, so everyone was quite happy that they had their son. And he was named for Eliza's father, General Philip Schuyler. People at that time often named their children for their own parents. So when we're looking at historical records, it can become very confusing when every other generation, all of the children have the same names. Sometimes cousins have the same names in the same generation. So I'm sure some of you have seen this lovely portrait of young Philip Hamilton. And there are no surviving portraits of George Eacker, so we'll just use Mr. Hamilton. So young Hamilton grows up. He is going to be the oldest of 8 children, and he is everything to his father. His father is preparing him to take his place in life, which is what gentlemen did with their firstborn son. Your son was your legacy and would carry on whatever you'd begun in your life. So Hamilton was hard at work making sure that Philip had all the advantages and met all of the people he would need to know in order to move into this position himself. And then in the year 1801, a young lawyer named George Eacker, who that year was 26, Mr. Hamilton was 19. Mr. Eacker was a very successful lawyer. He was admitted to the New York bar at only 21 years old. He was also a Democratic Republican, or as Mr. Hamilton might have called him, an anti-federalist. And that year for July 4th, he was selected to give the July 4th commemoration at a public event. And I'm sure you maybe can imagine that commemorative speech might have been just a little bit harsh on the Federalists of that time, as the Federalists and Democratic Republicans were well known for their sparring and insulting of each other. And at the end of the speech, Philip felt that the speech had insulted his father. Now, it wasn't until November of that year, when Mr. Hamilton was at the theater with his friend Mr. Price, that he saw Mr. Eacker in his box in the balcony with some other gentlemen, and the 2 teenagers ran up to the box and invaded the box, as people there said. And people there said the 2 teens were drunk and they were unruly and ungentlemanly. And at that time, they both challenged Mr. Eacker to a duel. Now, today, or I should say in your time, you might think, if you are a 26-year-old established gentleman, you're already a successful lawyer, and you can afford your own box at the theater, why would you even entertain a challenge from a drunk 19-year-old kid who's really not achieved anything yet in life? And that does sound sensible maybe to us. But at that time, if you refused a challenge of a duel, you were a coward. You were, I don't have it, waving the white feather. I should have got a white feather. You were waving the white feather. You were showing the white feather. You were a coward. So really, since it was a publicly challenged duel, Mr. Eacker had no choice but to accept the challenge from both young gentlemen. Now, when Mr. Hamilton told his father about this coming duel, his father was quite unhappy about it, and he explained to his son that he wanted him to go to Mr. Eacker and apologize for what he'd done and release him from the bond of the duel. In other words, withdraw the challenge to the duel. That he was young, he was impetuous, he did not understand what he had done, and he ought to withdraw the challenge to the duel. And young Philip refused. It's at that time people believe that Hamilton then instructed his son to engage in something called a délope, or a wasting your first shot in the duel, where both gentlemen would fire in New York into the ground next to the other. They would each say they missed. They would then shake hands, say that they had received satisfaction, and go home. In this way, you're still brave enough to go to the duel. You're still brave enough to stand facing each other and to even shoot your firearm. But you don't aim at each other. And then you claim, your guns are poor, your aim is poor, you're a bad shot. Whatever excuse you would like to use, you are now released from the bond of the duel. So people believe that Hamilton then instructed his son that this might be the best way for him to proceed in the duel. Now, the first duel was between Mr. Price and Mr. Eacker. And I believe 4 shots in total were fired at that duel. No one was hit, and both gentlemen received satisfaction and went home. The next duel was with Philip and Mr. Eacker. And there are many tellings of this duel, as there will be in the other Hamilton duel we'll be discussing. The general belief about this duel is that both men carefully followed all of the code duello. The duel did take place in Weehawken, New Jersey. I should have mentioned that the Church and Burr duel took place in Weehawken as well. Took place in Weehawken, New Jersey. The pistols used were his father, Mr. Hamilton's pistols. So Philip was familiar with the guns, and both seconds inspected the guns, and the hair trigger was not used. The guns were loaded, and both men took their place. I do not know who won the coin toss in this duel, although I believe it may have been young Philip Hamilton, as they said that as it was called to shoot, Mr. Hamilton seemed to shuffle around and be a bit unsure of what he was going to do, and that Mr. Eacker also looked a bit puzzled about what Hamilton was up to. So many people believe that Hamilton was planning to waste his shot at that time. Well, a moment or two went by when it seemed both men were not going to raise their guns. When Mr. Eacker raised his gun, Mr. Hamilton raised his gun, and they both fired, and Mr. Hamilton was shot in the hip. I believe the ball went clean through him, and he died the next day, leaving his father emotionally devastated. And I have a quote here. I think it is from Hamilton's lifelong friend, Robert Troup. Colonel Troup was, I think, also Hamilton's roommate at King's College. And he's also a friend of Mr. Burr's. And one of his letters to his daughter, Mr. Burr, referred to Colonel Troup, I think Theodosia was about 12 at this time, as our jolly fat friend, Colonel Troup. I thought that was quite amusing. Anyway, Colonel Troup remarked to Rufus King, another Federalist friend of Hamilton's, that Hamilton was a ruined man after the death of his son Philip, and that for 12 days he kept to himself, seeing no one, and wandered around in the woods beyond his country home, the Grange, which is today Harlem. Many people believe Hamilton never emotionally recovered from the loss of his son, and some people believe that Hamilton also blamed himself for the duel for not being able to talk his son out of it, or better, preparing his son for it. And when you study some of Hamilton's political decisions after the death of his son, you can see that Hamilton does become much more reckless after his son's death. So we have the unfortunate death of Philip Hamilton and George Eacker. George Eacker is buried at St. Paul's Chapel in New York. And if you're facing the church from the Broadway side, you're looking at the exit. His grave would be all the way at the back of the graveyard near the current site of the World Trade Center. Philip is buried at Trinity Graveyard, but they do not know the location of his grave, which I find to be quite interesting, that someone of his stature, his mother being Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton, his grandparents being Schuylers, and his father being Alexander Hamilton, that they do not know the location of his grave. So I thought that was quite interesting. And I'm sure whenever they dig, they still look for remains in the graveyard. And a couple of years ago, they found some, but they were not Mr. Hamilton's. So we have Mr. Hamilton and Mr. Eacker in 1801. Oh, another interesting thing of note, something I found to be very interesting, and that's what I'm looking for, an example of the exemplary types of gentlemen both Mr. Eacker and the elder Mr. Hamilton were, and that after the duel, when Mr. Eacker and Mr. Hamilton saw each other in the street, they were both perfectly civil to each other. So that tells us to some degree that Mr. Hamilton did not completely blame Mr. Eacker for the death of his son. As you know, Mr. Hamilton was known for his poison pen during this time in his life, and had he felt that Mr. Eacker had in any way cheated in the duel, he likely would have picked up his pen and written to ruin him, and that never occurred. The two men were always civil when they met each other in the street. So that, I think, is a bit of an indication that everything in the duel went according to the code as written. Next duel. Let me see what I have to share for you in pictures. Okay. I wasn't sure what I had selected to show you for this. Prepared these a few days ago. Our next duel is going to take place in early 1804, and it starts out as a feud between two newspaper publishers. James Cheetham, the publisher of the American Citizen, which you can see on the top of the picture, and William Coleman, who is the portrait on the bottom of the picture. William Coleman will go on later in 1804 to be the first publisher of the New York Evening Post, started by his good friend Alexander Hamilton. So Mr. Cheetham is part of Hamilton's Federalist Circle. I'm sorry, Mr. Coleman. Oh, goodness. Tell anyone I made that mistake. Mr. Cheetham is a diehard Democratic Republican. Unfortunately, he is of the Clintonian faction and a supporter of that horrific Clinton DeWitt, whom we have never spoken about, but one day we will. And although he is a Democratic Republican, a rival and enemy of Mr. Burr's. So just to get that on the table. So that is Mr. James Cheetham and his paper, The American Citizen. And below, Mr. Coleman, part of Hamilton's inner circle and later the publisher of the New York Evening Post. Well, in one of these many feuds that went on at that time between Federalists and Anti-Federalists and political factions, in his newspaper, I have to look to be sure Mr. Q is not listening for this part. I think he is well occupied with something else. Mr. Cheetham, in his newspaper, accused Mr. Coleman, this gentleman here, fine gentleman, a married gentleman with children, of fathering a mulatto child out of wedlock with obviously a non-white woman. Incredibly scandalous when this appeared in the newspaper. As you can imagine, Mr. Coleman immediately challenged Mr. Cheetham to a duel, and Mr. Cheetham accepted. Now, before the duel could be carried out, both men found themselves arrested on the order of Judge Brockholst Livingston. And this is one of the many, many, many Livingstons. I'm not sure whose son he is. I think he might be Phillips, but don't hold me to that because there are so many Livingstons. Judge Brockholst Livingston ordered both men arrested and jailed and held until they gave him their word as gentlemen that they would not duel. The reason for this? Judge Livingston was against dueling and was trying to have dueling permanently outlawed in America. Judge Livingston himself had participated in a duel a few years before. He'd written, may have been verses, it may have been a poem, could have been a play, but my mind is saying verses, so I think it probably was a poem, and it was brutally satirized by another gentleman. Judge Livingston threatened that gentleman to a duel, and he killed him in that duel. And Judge Livingston regretted it all of his life, as he said it was an absolute useless waste of precious life for a man to die over something like that. So he was very much against dueling and working to outlaw dueling. So he got the two gentlemen to agree that they would not duel, and upon making the agreement, they were released from jail. And then a friend of Mr. Cheetham's, a colonel or Captain Jameson, a ship captain, started spreading rumors that Mr. Coleman leaked intelligence of the duel, knowing that would reach Judge Livingston and that Judge Livingston would stop the duel. In other words, Mr. Coleman was a coward and in fear of facing Mr. Cheetham in a duel. So what do you suppose happened there? Mr. Coleman challenged Captain Jameson to a duel, and Captain Jameson accepted, which may have not been the smartest thing he would do in his life, as Mr. Coleman at that time had been the survivor of 11 duels. So the gentlemen agreed to their duel. I don't know if I have the me check here very quickly to see if I have the date. Oh, I don't think the date is recorded. The date is just recorded as sometime early 1804, so it's probably January or February. And it took place on the Lover's Lane, which today is 28th Street between 6th and 7th Avenues. At that time, it was quite in the country where no one would be. And it took place at sundown, so it was dark when it took place. And unfortunately for Colonel Jameson, he did not survive the duel, and Mr. Coleman survived his 12th duel that evening. And of course, everyone disavowed any knowledge of that duel ever happening. Even Mr. Jameson on his deathbed denied that he had been in a duel. I guess he just said he was randomly shot by someone, not sure, but he denied that the duel happened. So very unfortunate event for him. But Mr. Cheetham went on throughout the year 1804, and you might know, virtually every day published the most scandalous, disgusting propaganda against Mr. Burr, Vice President Burr, that one could ever imagine. So Mr. Cheetham, one might say, stayed around to help create the political environment that led to the big duel in 1804 in July between Mr. Hamilton and Mr. Burr. Our final duel, Mr. Hamilton versus Mr. Burr. 1804. Mr. Burr is Vice President of the United States of America. Mr. Hamilton's political star is a bit waning after his antics in the election of 1800 and the rise of Democratic Republicans in New York, who were the favored party at that time. And Mr. Burr decided to run for governor of New York that year. And it was the worst political decision of his life. And I believe that if my good friend, Mrs. Theodosia Prevost Burr, were still alive at that time, Mr. Burr would never have made such a strategic mistake in his political career. He decided to run for governor of New York. Now, I mentioned before that the Democratic Republican newspaper published by Mr. Cheetham was not favorable to Mr. Burr. It was favorable instead to the Clinton family faction, who were against Mr. Burr. And of course, the Federalists were also against Mr. Burr. So Mr. Burr really was fighting an uphill battle that year running for governor. The Federalists could not find a candidate to stand against Mr. Burr. Mr. Hamilton asked his good friend, Senator Rufus King, and in what I believe is one of the greatest quotes ever about the state of New York, Rufus King replied he would not do it because he said a man of integrity and independence would never be happy in the governor's seat of New York. An excellent quote, if I do say so. One maybe you ought to remember in the future as the years go by. Rufus King being their only option and refusing, their only other option was to find another Democratic Republican, and that was Morgan Lewis. So that was the matchup in 1804. And the newspapers, of course, were full of the most horrific articles imaginable. Well, elections were held a little bit differently then for the governor, and rather than being one massive statewide election, as I believe it is in your time, each small town, village, or city voted themselves for their candidate. And then those towns' votes were tallied, and the winner was chosen from that. So it was a little bit more representative of something similar to an electoral college here in New York than a massive vote by the public. So a little bit different. And as these votes were taking place, some gentlemen were in Albany at dinner. And of course, Mr. Hamilton was talking about what a rascal Mr. Burr was and what a scandalous character he was, and that he had no respect as a gentleman and should not be governor. And one of the young men present at that dinner, a gentleman named Charles D. Cooper, wrote down everything Mr. Hamilton said at the dinner. And the next thing you know, this began being published in the newspapers. And when Mr. Cheetham published it in the American Citizen, people then began asking Mr. Burr what he intended to do about it. And Mr. Burr's response was that as a gentleman, of course, he never read the American Citizen and had no idea what might be printed in it. Of course, Mr. Burr read the American Citizen to see what they were saying about him, but as a gentleman, he never read the American Citizen. And he hoped that that would make everything go away. But the furor continued, and eventually Mr. Cooper sent Mr. Burr a letter directly with the allegations of what Mr. Hamilton said to him. And at that time, Mr. Burr sat down and tried to decide the best way to get himself and Mr. Hamilton out of this situation. And he wrote Mr. Hamilton a letter, a very short letter, and in it he included the letter from Mr. Cooper, and he asked Mr. Hamilton, he says, as a gentleman, I'm sending you this letter I received from one Charles D. Cooper. I would like you to read it and then to either confirm or disavow its contents. Yours, Mr. Aaron Burr, and he sends off a very short little letter. And he gets in response a rather long and wordy response from Mr. Hamilton. The response is at least 2 pages. It may be 4 as I mix up the sequences of these letters when I remember them. But it is a very long letter in which Mr. Hamilton responds that Mr. Burr is not really clear in his use of English and grammar as to what he is asking Mr. Hamilton. So he says, I don't know any Charles D. Cooper. So if that's what you're asking me, I can tell you I do not know a Charles D. Cooper. And I, don't have anything to do with his letter. I can disavow knowing him, and I can disavow any knowledge of the letter he wrote you, but I cannot disavow the intent of the letter, as I agree with the statements therein. He says, whether or not I said them, I cannot say, because I cannot remember any time in which I was in the company of Mr. Cooper, but I agree with all of the statements in the letter. So now, Mr. Hamilton and Mr. Burr engage in a letter writing campaign throughout the spring of 1804, writing letters back and forth to each other, the letters becoming more angry, and I might say, if you've read them, ridiculous as they go on. Well, the 2 gentlemen who would serve as seconds in the duel were also delivering the letters. And one of the things I found to be, quite objectionable, when I was in school, I learned that the 2 gentlemen delivering the letters and the seconds in the duel were innocent young men. I assure you they were not. They were 2 gentlemen at the bar in New York, esteemed trial lawyers, and in their mid to late 30s. For Mr. Hamilton, it was Nathaniel Pendleton, and for Mr. Burr, it was Mr. Peter Van Ness. So dispose of any notions that these 2 seconds were young, innocent gentlemen, as they were not so young or innocent, but they were gentlemen. At one point, Mr. Van Ness and Mr. Pendleton wrote to each other, suggesting they interfere in the delivery of these letters as the tone was becoming rather alarming. And at one point, they thought they'd worked out a deal between the 2 gentlemen, but in the end, Mr. Hamilton rejected it. When Mr. Hamilton returned to New York, Mr. Burr sent either his friend Peter Van Ness or his servant Tom, we're not sure who it was, to see Mr. Hamilton about the issue, and Mr. Hamilton told him to leave. He said, go home and tell Burr to do as he must, which Mr. Hamilton fully knew meant challenge him to a duel. And Mr. Burr sat down and reluctantly wrote the challenge to the duel to Mr. Hamilton, who wrote back that he accepted the duel. At that time, both men sat down before the duel, and they wrote wills and they wrote letters to people to whom they wanted to have them delivered in the case of their death. And in the case of Hamilton, of course, that was his wife. And in the case of Mr. Burr, that was his daughter, now Mrs. Joseph Alston of Charleston, South Carolina. Burr also wrote a couple of other letters bequeathing property to a number of his servants and things like that. So both men got their affairs in order. And in July 1804, off to Weehawken, New Jersey, they went. And the same guns from his son's duel were used in the father, Alexander Hamilton's duel. So they are Hamilton's guns, which meant that Mr. Burr's second had the first choice of gun, which was part of the Code Duello in New York, New Jersey. So the person who is bringing the gun has second selection of the gun, or the remainder gun. So Mr. Burr and Mr. Van Ness chose the gun. A coin was flipped, and Mr. Pendleton won the coin toss. Mr. Burr and Mr. Van Ness had arrived early at the dueling site where they cleared out all of the sticks and pebbles so they would have an even dueling field. And Mr. Burr and Mr. Pendleton arrived next. Once the coin toss was made and Mr. Pendleton was the winner, the two men had their guns loaded by their seconds. They went out to stand in their respective spots, and it was Mr. Pendleton who counted down 3, 2, 1 and instructed them to fire. And both men fired their weapons, but there is quite a bit of difference of opinion of who fired when and why. So I will give you both stories of the seconds at the duel, and I will leave it to you to decide which, if either, you believe. Remembering that these are both skilled lawyers, trial lawyers, and political operatives for their respective political parties. So Mr. Pendleton says that Mr. Hamilton stood in his place, aimed his gun over Mr. Burr's head, and fired over his head, purposely missing Mr. Burr. He said Hamilton did not intend to shoot his gun at all, but was holding it over Mr. Burr's head, and that it was Mr. Burr who shot first, hitting Mr. Hamilton in the hip, causing him to pull the trigger on his gun and shoot the branch above his head. And that branch was hit by Mr. Hamilton, so we know at least he fired and hit the branch. Mr. Burr's second, Mr. Van Ness, says, no, that's not what happened at all. Mr. Hamilton fired first above Mr. Burr's head, wasting his shot as a gentleman would, and he hit the branch. That Mr. Burr then waited a few seconds for the smoke between them to clear, and then he fired his gun in the traditional manner in the dirt next to Mr. Hamilton. The guns being so poorly designed, he accidentally hit Mr. Hamilton in the hip on that side. He said, I know Vice President Burr was stunned when Mr. Hamilton was hit, as he immediately dropped his weapon where he stood and ran to see what happened. He said, I removed Mr. Burr from the dueling site at that time. Now, if it helps at all, the gentlemen who were in the rowboats who brought them over, as well as the doctor present, said there was about a 4 or 5 second delay in the two shots, which might mean that Mr. Burr did not shoot first and hit Mr. Hamilton, causing him to fire his gun, which would be almost immediate, and that Mr. Hamilton maybe did shoot first and Mr. Burr was wasting his shot. Whichever story you'd like to believe, you are welcome to believe. I tend to believe there is likely a bit of embellishment in each of their stories in order to favor their gentleman and their political party. In your time, one of the best descriptions of this duel I have ever read is written by Mr. Joseph Ellis in the first chapter of his book, Founding Brothers. The first chapter is about Hamilton and Burr and the duel, and Mr. Ellis believes that Burr shot second, that Hamilton shot first, and that Burr did wait for the smoke to clear and that he shot second. But he adds an interesting little twist of his own, and that he says, we'll never truly know Mr. Burr's intentions as he never wrote it down. And since Mr. Hamilton did shoot first in this scenario, and no one knows whether Mr. Hamilton really meant to miss him or meant to hit him, Mr. Burr would be well within his rights of the code to take aim and shoot Mr. Hamilton dead right there. So a little interesting twist from Mr. Ellis, but he does not believe that's the case because he says Mr. Burr was far too good a politician to risk killing Mr. Hamilton and risk the effect that that would have not only on his own future political career, but possibly on the political career of his son-in-law, Mr. Alston of South Carolina. So I will leave it to you to decide what happened in that duel. And as you know, Mr. Hamilton died an extremely painful death. It took him about a day to die, and Mr. Burr was vilified in the newspapers for killing him, but not by everyone. As one person who was not a big fan of Mr. Hamilton's exclaimed, Hamilton's funeral was simply Wagnerian in scope. The Federalists did everything possible to turn it into the biggest affair of the century. So a little bit of a Democratic Republican view of Hamilton's funeral. And you know, his wife lived on for 50 more years without him and raised their remaining children. Do you know that at the time of the duel, Mr. and Mrs. Hamilton had a son who was only 2 years old named Philip? After their oldest son was killed in the duel, she had another son to replace him in the lineage, also named Philip, who they call Little Phil, who never knew his father. That and next week is the Thursday before Halloween. Mr. and Mrs. Q will be attending a masquerade ball, and I think Mrs. Q will be in her costume for our evening together. So Mrs. Q, I believe, will be dressed for a costume ball next week, and we'll be talking about costume balls, pleasure gardens, and the way we had parties and entertained at that time. So thank you all for joining me, and I will see you next week. Feel free to wear a mask or a costume next week of your own if you would like to join me. It might be a bit fun. So thank you, and I will see you next week. And for those of you who have contributed, thank you very much. And if you'd like to, just go to patriottoursnyc.com. And hopefully I will see all of you on Tuesday as the real life 20th century me. Have a lovely week and a good night and a safe journey home.